Welcome to the show. I'm your host. My name is Darren Argyle. And in this session, we're going to be discussing the evolution of data security and organizational risk. We are living through a moment where the rules of cybersecurity are changing faster than most organizations can adapt. Security teams are burning out, and the traditional approach, throwing more tools at the problem, just isn't working anymore. In fact, it's getting worse. And I've been in the industry long enough to recognize a fundamental shift that is happening right now. And I think it's being compounded by things like generative AI, which is accelerating threats, and the increasing compliance demands across every industry vertical. So today I'm going to be speaking with somebody who's got a front seat row at the transformation of this, Bjorn Engelhardt, who is the Asia Pacific Vice President for Forcepoint. Forcepoint, previously WebSense, is a powerful unified data security engine that simplifies the complexity that executives are drowning in. So some of the things that we're going to be covering today are how do we go from WebSense to Forcepoint and how that company has transformed from a web filter company to becoming a data security leader. What data security challenges are keeping CISOs up at night and what some of those CISO teams can do right now. Why complexity has become the biggest vulnerability in enterprises today. And if we stay till the end, Bjorn will articulate some of the things that vendors just won't say out loud. So let's get into it. Bjorn, welcome to the show. And I know you're joining us from the ski slopes of Japan. So really appreciate your time today. So before we get into the specifics, Bjorn, can you help the audience understand the history of Forcepoint and how its business strategy and portfolio has evolved?
Sure. And thank you for the invitation, Darren. And I wouldn't want to be anywhere else but on this call rather than out on the slopes. To take that for what, how true it could be. So look, Forcepoint, is actually a real interesting company and, we have a real proud history. And as you mentioned, it did start back in 1994 as WebSense. And as the name suggests, it was web filtering when the web was just starting to grow. And, people were trying to protect from the traditional threats of people wanting to graffiti a website or try to bring down systems, etc. But the idea of stealing data didn't really exist back then. But as you look probably the 10 years from 94 to early 2000s, you saw a lot of companies were obviously digitizing and bring business online. Information was becoming more valuable, more readily available online. And so the risk and the cyber threats changed from what I would call kind of, let's just be a little destructive to being, let's try and take that information. So it was around 2015 where WebSense was acquired by Raytheon. Many of you would know Raytheon is a large US military provider, but they really saw an opportunity to broaden into cybersecurity, bringing together the WebSense business, Stonesoft from Intel, the firewalls, plus a few other investments, really rebranding under the Forcepoint name, which was going from traditional kind of basic web security into more a data or information-centric security back then. And so that was kind of really the first time Forcepoint name came around about 2015.
Great. Do you know what? It's interesting, Bjorn, because when I was just getting into cybersecurity, I remember one of the first platforms that we bought was WebSense. So I have fond memories of using that technology way back when cybersecurity was literally emerging. So great to get some of that background. And I think that's important because, when we understand some of the history, it helps us position where our platforms are today. At what stage did Forcepoint become a leader in data security, because according to lots of analyst reports, and we can see this, certainly when I speak to peers now, it's a brand that's becoming prominent in the data security space. So, but when did you see it becoming as a kind of an emerging leader in that space?
Yeah, I think, as we mentioned with Raytheon's acquisition, they wanted to change the market offerings out there. There was nobody focusing really around data security, and DLP was very much an emerging technology. I think, Darren, from your background and my background, previously, we would have seen DLP was really just a nascent technology. And so with Raytheon's investment back in that stage, we expanded our DLP offerings, made some more acquisitions, continued to build on the portfolio. And We were pretty successful with it. We won DLP Vendor of the Year 9 years in a row through Gartner. It's incredibly proud to sort of have that history, and that history carries on today. And I know we'll later talk on some of the the challenges that organizations are facing as they need to get beyond DLP. But really, that sort of foundation has really stood us well as we've continued to extend the portfolio. Customers probably range from your traditional banks and financial services, governments, the communications, even down to the smallest of organizations in that supply chain who understands that, hey, I've got sensitive information that I don't want to leak out. And so it was really that period of 2015 Raytheon acquisition, probably through to about the early 2020s, where Raytheon ended up selling Forcepoint to Francisco Partners, and that was really the next phase of the company.
And you touch on a key point. I was watching a recent webinar on the World Economic Forum, and they were talking about the growing threat of third-party risk. So that data security, extended enterprise risk, that supply chain risk, I think is something that has also been accelerated by AI as well when it comes to data security. So you need to keep a keen eye on that. That's for sure. It's the ecosystem now has become the threat, and if you know where your data is and you're able to control it, get some controls around it as well, then you've got a better chance of being more secure. So look, how has the Forcepoint portfolio evolved since? Because often you start off in one area and you dominate it, but then it's quite a natural evolution to start taking advantage of other areas where you can add more value. So how has that portfolio evolved for Forcepoint?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think you look at really what drives technology. You've got product-led technology, you've got customer-led pressure and influences as well. I think one is needing to be a visionary, and one is listening to customers, and you kind of converge the two forces together. And so, as I mentioned, back in 2022, Francisco Partners acquired Forcepoint from Raytheon, and I think it's been a real interesting 4 years now since that acquisition, or 5 years actually, I think, since that acquisition took place. And what we've seen is a couple of things. The market pressures are that customers need to get more understanding of their data. The DLP solved a problem, but it wasn't the whole problem that exists today. What we've done since then, we've acquired CASB, a leading provider of CASB, several years back to expand our portfolio. And in essence, you can look at CASB as DLP for cloud applications, right? Secondly, we just recently acquired an AI native DSPM company that allows us to look at data and not only understand it just based on pattern matching, but also on the context or the contextual value of that data and say, is this what it really it means to be or tries to be versus, hey, it just matches a certain types of rules, etc. Now, the thing that's really important with that is how we've integrated it. You can buy these different products and give them out to customers at product A, product B, product C with the same logo on, but the ability to integrate and sort of pass policies, pass intelligence KPIs from each of those between CASB and DLP, for example, between web and DLP, for example, really is what I guess has been where our investment has been over the last few years.
Yeah, the last point there, Bjorn, is probably something over my career I've wrestled with more than anything else, is that you often start working with a trusted advisor, like trusted vendor like yourself. But then, as the acquisitions start to happen, which inevitably will happen with a large enterprise organization like yourselves, sometimes they don't quite mend together really well. And it sounds like, Forcepoint have done a really good job of that. And that seamless integration between those acquisitions, I think, is where vendors either rise or fall, in my view, especially at the enterprise level, because you're really looking for that integration points to reduce the complexity. And as we said right at the start, the complexity is one of the biggest enemies of cybersecurity. So it's good to know that, Forcepoint have put some effort into making sure that integration is as seamless as possible. So I guess you've done well from a Gartner perspective. We've talked about the long history there. You've also got the Frost & Sullivan Company of the Year for 2 years consecutively. But what's the one thing you think Forcepoint does better than anyone else out there that the thing that would matter to a CISO, and I always think about this in terms of when I've ever been a CISO, my ability to do my job, so if you were talking to a CISO and this is really going to help you as a CISO to do your job, what would you say that one thing is?
Yeah, let's go back to I guess the last topic we just talked about is
Yeah,
integration between platforms and between tools and different types of solutions that you have. And sometimes people don't understand the complexity and the work required to integrate different tools. And to me, that's probably one of the most important areas and what is our secret weapon. Sometimes not easy to get that out to a customer or out to one of our partners and truly understand. But to me, I've been here at Forcepoint 6 years and I've been with data security for 20 years nearly. And having a data security only focus, I think, is the thing that sets us apart. Look, there are many companies out there who will have a DLP solution, will have a CASB solution, will have different types, but it's part of a much bigger portfolio. And I think when it comes to data security, truly having a singular focus is what sets us apart. Now, I think I could add a few points below that. It's the full life cycle of what we do, that we don't just have a DLP, but we start at the beginning of discovering and classifying, understanding and prioritizing data. We have our heritage DLP, as you talked about. We've been in
yeah,
that market, countless awards, which I think gives us credibility to have conversations with customers. And then recently, as we bring in like our AI mesh platform to help better understand the data and also create better security posture, is kind of part of our vision around providing data security everywhere, not just data security on one channel or on one type of data, whether it's fixed, whether it's unstructured, etc. And so I think if just to summarize, go back, it's our singular focus on data security that sets us apart and gives us an unfair advantage.
that's good. I've always liked this idea of having capabilities, and I always think about things in terms of capabilities, having a centralized capability that you can really trust around data security. But data security from, in the roles that I've done can be just literally one risk type category, and it's broad, very broad. So if you've got like a dominant platform like you've got with Forcepoint in that space, you've got something you can really trust and rely on, because you might plug in other things around it, but you need something sturdy at the center of that. And if you've got a vendor out there that's dominating in that space, which obviously Forcepoint is, it gives you a level of confidence that that you can renew year after year and build on what you've already invested in, and feel that you've got a good return on your investment, which is ultimately what we're all looking for as senior executives. So that's
Yeah,
good
you're
to
very
hear.
right. So you're
Yeah,
very right there, Darren. The data security, whilst we simplify it and say data security, maybe in a single phrase, it is a very broad area, and you do have to approach it based on a risk level. The ability to solve it, for the whole organization between structured and unstructured, is challenging. And I'm sure we'll talk later about some of the ways to prioritize it, but that is the biggest challenge, that data is all encompassing in so many different places.
yeah. So in so many different places and growing extensively, I always remember looking at some of those charts that you'd see on a slide, and it may have been back in the day, but the growth of data, dark data, structured data, and it's just ridiculous, just the growth of data. But knowing where it is and being able to secure it is a massive challenge that I don't think many organizations truly understand how to do. And it's good to know that Forcepoint does. So it gives a level of, so, these days, with vendors are making lots of different claims, and you'll see many emerging kind of platforms in the data security space claiming that they've now solved it. I have to be a little bit skeptical, knowing just how long it takes to build a true enterprise capability that you've built with Forcepoint. Building these platforms means a lot of trial and error. You have to work with lots of customers. So simply being a new entrant into the market saying you can do all these wonderful things, it really needs to be tested over time with genuine customer interaction. So, and I know that's something you've done with Forcepoint. It's been, I think the right word is battle tested, is probably the right word, the words that I'd use. So what's changed, would you say, Bjorn, in the last 18, 24 months that's making the enterprises actually ready to consolidate around your platform versus, waiting 2 to 3 years more in this space?
You talked about battle testing, and I think there's a saying, we have to win every time, they only have to win once, right? When we're
Yeah.
talking about the attackers. And so being battle ready, being battle tested, to use your terminology there, I think is a great way to look at it, and how you should go about choosing somebody, to secure your data. And so what has changed? Look, I'd say one market driver is AI. You started
Yeah.
talking about AI, and everybody wants to use AI and adopt Gen AI, adopt agentic AI, adopt possibly other forms of AI in the organization. And the other challenge we have with that is, what data is source data and what is created by AI? And then trying to understand and protect what what is coming out of AI at the same time, right? You can consolidate huge amounts of data that may look innocent into something incredibly valuable, right? And so we're seeing Gen AI. Gen AI then drives regulatory compliance. The
Mm.
regulators are looking at how it's being adopted, how it's being used, who's handling. Are you passing data from agent to agent, right? And do you have controls on your data in there? So we see that. I see the tech situation. Too many tools. You mentioned that at the very beginning.
Mm.
A lot of tools out there in the industry, and I think everyone's coming up with, I'm going to solve that problem, this problem, that particular problem, but not the enterprise problem, right? And so for those who've been in cyber for a long time, that a tool
Mm.
was created to solve a problem, and then another tool and another tool, and we just kept on adding. And I think that's the challenge where we've got to. And then you look at the budget constraints that come along with that, is that too many tools, more budget for the tools, more budgets for training, more budgets for people. And so that becomes really challenging. I think I'd also see the customer feedback as really driven that don't have as much skills, the access to skills, the access to people, their budget. So I want to consolidate, if I can, around people's skills. Like, I think you can imagine, if you have a single platform that reports in a single way, that looks at your data in a single way, you don't need to train people. You don't have one for DLP for web, one for your endpoint, one for your email, and training people on that. And, I think just, they say, a lot of customers say they're ready. There is, a demand. So it really comes back to the beginning, the market drivers, the tech drivers, customers saying they're ready to have for consolidation. I'm hearing it more and more, particularly in a mid-market, and in a country like Australia, where you're coming from today, is very
Yeah.
much a mid-market country.
Yeah.
And they don't have the luxury of teams and teams across every part of their cyber.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Bjorn. We're coming under certainly increasing cost pressures. I mean, I've had that in all the roles that I've done, and you reach a level of maturity with your cybersecurity capabilities, and then the next phase is, how do you start to consolidate and get some return on investment and obviously some efficiencies? And what I've seen, and what I think Forcepoint's doing really well, is this ability to have a kind of bench platform that multiple teams can use, where you can look online and find people who've already got those skills to just engage in Forcepoint. Often that's never the case with a new emerging technology, where you're having to kind of build the skills as you go, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Whereas Forcepoint, you've got people out there who've been using that platform over time, and that heritage skill set means that you're not going to be at risk or having those single points of failure. And being able to work on one platform across the entire organization, because let's be clear, it's not just security teams involved in data security. You've got IT professionals, you've got business leaders, and ultimately you've got executives who are going to need to see some reporting from that. So being able to allow for all these different stakeholders to interact with that platform as a unified platform just makes everything more streamlined, and especially with the integration with other GRC type platforms like ServiceNow, for example,
Yep.
which is what I really like about Forcepoint. The more that I've spent time looking at it, is how that you get that seamless integration and how teams can work together, because that's where you get your true efficiencies. Yeah, so I do want to talk more about that kind of efficiencies piece, because I think that's an important point as well.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of organizations who spend more time consolidating the various feeds or logs from different systems, rather than trying to look at what is this data? How do I turn this data into intelligence or actionable intelligence that I can do something with? And you make a point that you want your executives to be able to consume the data quickly. You don't want them to go to a data analyst to say, run a report, that then purge through and say, I think we've got a problem here. I know many CEOs even some of Australia's largest companies have very tech-savvy CEOs
Yeah.
who would wake up in the morning and look at dashboards, threat dashboards, and saying, how will we position? What has happened overnight? How are we ready to respond or capable to respond to some of those threats as well? And so kind of goes back again to the conversation around complexities. We've got to take that complexity out to get to actionable intelligence very quickly rather than being focused on tools. And I think that's kind of a mindset shift I've seen, particularly in our domain area around data, is that the tool, is less now important now than getting at the outcome. Obviously, there's an expectation that the tool or the platform you buy does what it says on the box. But being able to consume that data and make decisions, whether it's the executive level, whether it's the GRC team, whether it's the IT security team who needs to respond quickly,
Yeah.
or even at the user level, being able to immediately notify a user, hey, yeah, you've done something that's against policy, to either stop or prompt them to think about and retrain them in real time.
Yeah, and I think this, you mentioned Australia, obviously, where I'm calling in from today. We've had a lot of breaches, right? Recently, these incidents in Australia.
High profile breaches,
Yeah, high
unfortunately.
profile breaches as well, and probably in some of the brands that you wouldn't expect. But I think what comes up time and time again, which you've been alluding to, Bjorn, is that often when these incidents happen, the big question is, what data has gone missing?
Mhm.
What data has gone missing, and how quickly can we find out? Now, your board's demanding that, your business is demanding that, because the businesses are concerned about, the theft of their data, their customers, from a customer database perspective, and they're worried about that ending up on the dark web. And obviously, regulators are really keen on this as well. What data have you lost? Because, sometimes data can be lost, but if it's encrypted, we know we're okay. So it might not even be a reportable incident in that instance. But without having the right tools to know where your data is and access it in an intelligent way that can quantify, both in terms of how sensitive was it and the quantity of it, who had access to it, all those different questions that I would be asking of my data security team in the event of an incident. Forcepoint's doing that better than anybody out there right now. And I think where this also becomes crucial as well is not just in the midst of an incident. And what we're seeing evolve now is where there's crisis simulation exercises, which are not just sporadic, they become quite routine. They're now having to rely in those crisis simulation exercises with executives and boards and business leaders around the table saying, okay, this incident is happening and you're running through the scenario. Now, can you give me some good incident data about where our data is? And if you can do that in real time, working in those crisis simulation exercises, you give so much confidence. And this is what I love about what Forcepoint is able to do, probably better than anybody. So that's where I see, it's one thing doing it whilst an incident is happening, but able to proactively do that during a crisis exercise. It just gives everybody that level of confidence that we've chosen the right product and it's giving the insights that we can rely on.
And I think, Darren, and then gives you insights that then you go and action and you can test it again. I think Gartner, I think it was somewhere around about 80% of organizations' enterprise survey couldn't confidently say they knew exactly where their sensitive data was.
Yeah.
And you've seen in some of those breaches that took place in Australia, and in fact, a breach that takes place anywhere, very few organizations can, quickly respond and say nothing was taken. And we know that categorically
Yeah.
because we knew where our data was. Secondly, it took some of them weeks or months, and even took the attackers posting data out to say, you know what, we actually have some of your data. You don't want to be in that situation
No,
where
you don't.
someone trickle feeding out sensitive customer information and saying, well, try me. Let's see how much I really have. And I think one of the things that we talked about what's kind of changed around data security was we started with DLP. And in fact, DLP is kind of the end of the life cycle. It's the quick and easy one to put some policies in, credit cards, IDs, passports, etc. But let's go back to the beginning and understand what I've got and classify it and where it is and saying, really, should I have access or should that data be in this location? Should it be accessible by all of these people? Credential theft is still one of the common ways of
Yeah.
breaches, right? And we see so much data that's over credentialed. We see so much duplicate data, so much redundant data. in different places. People also have a need for it. You can think in me as a
Yeah.
salesperson, I download a Salesforce report, I copy it up into the cloud, I share it with somebody else. Suddenly, data's everywhere. Now, assuming we didn't stop it and a breach does happen, and if you where it is, how can you confidently say, I don't need to pay a ransom or I do need to pay a ransom, right? And
Yeah.
I think that sometimes we've got to get to that understanding of where important data is.
Yeah. Do you know what? That confidence is hard, to really get these days. And I've been in those rooms, beyond where, that question has been asked of me. How confident are you? Right. That it's like from 1 to 10. And actually the 1 to 10 has been used around the table as a level of confidence, whether we should pay the ransom or not, or just around the room, put your hands up. Who should we pay or not? This is literally the rooms that I've been in. Now, if you're the one being asked the question at the very start of that, round table during a crisis or even a crisis simulation, because the confidence question would come up again. If you can sit there and be confident about the answer that you're giving around the data, where it is, who's got access to it, the level of sensitivity, and the likelihood that you think it's been stolen or not, then that's a really good place to be. The opposite of that is not having the confidence and being unsure. One, you look very bad in front of the executive, and two, they'll end up making a decision that they might not need to make. And regulators will come down very heavily on a boardroom that couldn't make the decision because they didn't have the right information. And
Yeah,
that's one of the biggest problems.
yeah, I'd say, Darren, and the irony in all of this is to get that confidence isn't as hard as people think.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, the continuous protecting and stopping threats as they happen, is definitely not an easy task. But understanding where your data is, discovering it, classifying it, prioritizing it, looking at permissions, creating that dashboard is actually quite easy. It's an investment in time, it's an investment in technology. But once you've got to a steady state, you're constantly updating. You can take real-time action. Hey, Bjorn has copied something onto a public share. He should in real-time action. And so being able to use to go into a meeting and know from fact based on what the technology or the dashboards are telling you would give any CISO or any executive a level of confidence to put their hand up and say, you know what, I'm 9 out of 10% confident
Yeah.
that we're in a good position.
Yeah. It's definitely what we all look for when we're in the hot seat. So look, Bjorn, we're kind of drawing to the end of our discussion today, which has been great. And thank you for taking the time. And I know you want to get back to that amazing holiday that you're on right now in Japan. So the last thing basically, Bjorn, was, if we've got as a CISO listening right now to this discussion and they're wrestling, whether to move on with some kind of consolidation, could you give us some of the things that they might want to be considering for that approach on data security? What might be some of the things that you might want to be prioritizing? And obviously how Forcepoint could help them with that.
It's a really good question, probably a great way to wrap up our conversation. One is take the time to understand and think about your data and the breadth and the complexity of what data you do have. Many people kind of make assumptions and speak. If I'm a CISO, I would be speaking to my business owners, asking my business owners if they have a view on what's important, because ultimately it's we in the cyber industry, we are the practitioners who support our business partners, right?
Yeah.
And so it always should start with a conversation with your business. Then if you're from a technology side, I think one is calculate the risk of what you currently have and the complexity of what you have. What tools have you made investments in? What's working? Where are your gaps around that? And really understand the readiness. As you said, if you're going to do an incident role play, for example,
Mm.
where are your gaps? And then I would then suggest start with a pilot. Most organizations have a team or a business unit they can start with and say, right, let's pilot, let's test it on a full life cycle. The thing I see with a lot of companies is it's ready, fire, aim. A lot of companies say, I know what I need. I need this. I don't know what my problem statement is really. And I'm being a little bit black and white about it because I'm sure a lot of, executives and CISOs are quite, familiar with their data, but a lot of people jump to a solution before they've taken that step back to truly understand what they have, how the company's using it, what the business wants as well. So, understand your current environment, the complexity, understand your readiness to deal with incidents as they happen. And then 3, start with a small pilot and test and make sure you you know what you're getting.
Great. The problem statement there, Bjorn, I'll just pick out as your one of the key points that stands out for me. You're right, we jump to solutions, but actually, if you can get very clear about the problem that you're trying to solve, you've got a far better chance of coming up with solutions that really hit the mark. And that's got to be a great place to start. And as you said, running some kind of pilot is going to make all the difference because you can just prove that it's working in practice.
Yeah, we do a thing called a data risk assessment. I think
Right.
it's a bit of a industry standard terminology around, let's pick a data share, for example, call it SharePoint, which is quite a common one. Let's analyze what we've got on there. Let's look at how the permissions are set, what type of information, etc. And very quickly you get something back out of that to say, okay, you know what? I thought we were doing this, but this really proves we're doing something different. Yeah, maybe good, maybe not, but kind of easy to start with that pilot or a data risk assessment process.
Great stuff. Okay, well, look, Bjorn, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. We'll wrap this up today. And where can people, go to find more information about Forcepoint? What would be a good place if you're a CISO or data security analyst or whatever to find more information about what you do?
Obviously, www.forcepoint.com is a great start. I think there's a click and chat now to a real AI bot that will pass you through to one of our eager sales folks out there. But reach out. Look, I think two things. Reach out to Forcepoint. But we also have some great partners around the Asia Pac and
Yeah,
global area business as well. I think most partners who work with data security today will know about Forcepoint and probably work with us in some shape or form. So contact a partner or reach out to us directly. We'd love to engage and spend some time with any of your viewers.
great stuff. Okay, well, thanks, Bjorn. Really appreciate your time and look forward to catching up again with you soon. Cheers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.